Welcome to today's training industry webinar, The Quiet Rebellion Happening in L&D, sponsored by BCL. I'm Amanda Longo, Creative Director at Training Industry, and I'm very happy you could join us for today's event. Before we get started, of course, a few tips and tricks to help you interact with our speaker and get the most out of our time together. Throughout today's program, please feel free to chat comments into the chat window and submit questions in the Q&A pod. We will address all comments throughout and questions at the end of our event during our official Q&A section with our speaker. Of course, we always encourage you to share the information you receive today with your colleagues via social media. Please follow at BCL Training and hashtag TI Webinars so we're able to track your contribution to the conversation. When our program ends, you'll notice a new tab has popped up in your browser with a short evaluation survey. And of course, we would love your feedback about today's content, speaker, or topics you might want us to cover here in the future. As always, today's event will be recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com, and you will receive a follow-up email from us that will include a link to the on-demand program for you to share with the team. If this is your first event with us, a very special welcome goes out to you. At Training Industry, we offer dozens of events like this each year on subjects ranging from hybrid learning and data fluency to what makes a great training organization, diversity and inclusion. We cover just about every topic relevant to learning leaders at training organizations around the globe. If you've attended one of our programs in the past, it's great to see you again. I know today's event is one that you'll find to be most useful, as we will dive into specific challenges L&D teams are facing in today's work climate and how companies are developing new methods to facilitate learning to overcome these challenges. Now, I want to go ahead and introduce you to my friend and today's awesome speaker. Nathan Pienkowski is a partner and co-founder of BCL, a Durham-based learning and development consulting agency. He has a doctorate in industrial design and has been working in the L&D field for almost 25 years. Nathan is passionate about unpacking problems to find the right solution to lead to real behavioral change. I'm really excited to hear key insights on the latest rebellion in L&D, from L&D's humble beginnings to where it is now and where it is heading in the future. So Nathan, I will turn it over to you. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen here. And let's see.
Perfect.
Okay. I hope everybody can see my screen, and I hope everyone's having a good day so far. Thank you for coming to my webinar on the Quiet L&D Rebellion of 2022. Now, most of us are familiar with a lot of well-known rebellions that have occurred in history. Of course, we've all heard of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, Shays Rebellion, smaller but still well-known, the Boxer Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, and among others, the Easter Rising of 1916 in Ireland. Now, most of us have heard of these rebellions because we're taught these things in school and we've read about them and things like that. But I wonder if any of you have heard of the Sales and Marketing Rebellion of 2010. And I'm guessing nobody has because this isn't as well known. But it's a really interesting story. And I think it may have been a symbol or a sign of things to come for L&D. Now, I want to tell you that story in just a minute. But before I do, some of you might be wondering sort of why I'm in a position to maybe talk about this and what my perspective might be. So first, before I get into it, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my organization and about me. So I'm one of the co-founders and partners of BCL. Until recently, we were known as Bull City Learning. We're a custom training agency based in Durham, North Carolina, and we've been around for about 8.5 years or so. We have 30 employees, and we're focused exclusively on creating custom learning programs for large organizations, usually in the private sector, but not exclusively, like the ones that you see down here. Now, the reason I bring this up is just to kind of mention or bring up the point that we work with probably dozens of companies every year, and we work on over 100 projects every year. And what that has afforded us, in addition to working on a lot of interesting projects with interesting people, is the ability to kind of see a lot of things that are happening out there, because we do get a sort of a peek into what's happening in all these different companies and on their different projects. So we do kind of have an ability to see some patterns and some trends. By no means is it scientific, but we do get some good insights from that. So I just kind of bring that up as we're bringing that perspective to the way we to our viewpoint here. And just about me, as I think was mentioned before, I'm an instructional designer by training and background. I've been building learning solutions of some form or another for 25 years, and I've got a PhD in the field. Okay, so I just bring this up to kind of give you a sense of my perspective and where I'm coming from when we talk about issues like this rebellion that I'm going to talk about. So let's start by talking about the sales and marketing rebellion of 2010. I bet people are like, what? I don't remember a rebellion happening in 2010. Well, this was another quiet one, but it's actually a love story. So this is a love story, as I think you'll see as we go forward. So before we talk about the rebellion that happened in 2010, of course, we need to talk a little bit about what was happening before the rebellion, what was happening in the run up to the sales and marketing rebellion of 2010. So before the rebellion, sales and marketing groups were out there doing their thing, and IT groups were out there doing their thing. And the sales and marketing folks, just like everyone in most corporations, they were using different technologies like laptops and mobile phones and print and sales aids and hardware and software and things like that, all of which were provisioned for them by IT. So everything that they used at the time was approved, evaluated, approved by IT. So this is by no means unusual. This is the case in most organizations and how we work with IT most of the time. So in an environment like this, sales and marketing, when they would see something new, new technology or a new sort of strategy or something that they wanted to implement that involved technology, they would of course have to work with IT. So they were in this kind of relationship where they would essentially ask, hey, can we do this or can we have this? And unfortunately, often the answer was no. Now, I'm not trying to bag on IT groups. They have their missions, their mandates, and things like that. But it's sort of an inevitable consequence of having to serve all these different functional units that they're going to end up not being able to support all of the technology needs of all the different groups. So, sales and marketing heard no a lot. And as a result of that, they sort of became acclimated to it, sort of accustomed to this equilibrium, and just sort of learned to make do with what they had. And, probably only went to IT for things when they really felt it was really super important, because, they could take the time to go through this kind of rigorous evaluation process. But even when they would, oftentimes they would hear no. Okay. Then in April 2010, something happened. And that something was the iPad. The iPad was introduced to the market, and sales and marketing folks fell absolutely in love with the iPad. They just had to get this. And I'm sure there were lots of reasons and business reasons, but their lust for this device was so strong that they just went out and bought them en masse. IT be darned. So they went out and acquired lots of different iPads, and they didn't go through IT. So we, in our experience, we started talking to organizations that were saying, hey, yeah, we went out and bought, 100, 200 iPads. We just sort of went and did it. So what happened one day is IT groups just sort of woke up, and they saw these people with these unsupported, sort of unevaluated hardware that they then had to support. And I'm sure it was quite a shock to them. So, but what was the result of that? Well, I'm sure that in many IT departments, there was some frustration and some anger, and I'm sure they went and talked to their stakeholders. But in the end, true love conquered all. Just like in Hollywood, the sales teams got to keep their iPads. Nothing really happened in that regard. So I think what this showed for a lot of sales and marketing teams is that before 2010, the sales and marketing teams had kind of been working under the assumption that, at least if you look at a relationship from a power standpoint, that IT really had the power in that relationship. But when they went around IT and bought these iPads, it showed that they actually had a little bit more power in that relationship than they thought. So, you know, this is just a little story, but is that the end of the story? So did the rebellion spread beyond sales? Well, certainly if you think of this as a story about technology, the answer is probably no, it didn't spread beyond sales. Because really, if you look at the use of the iPad in a corporate setting, you really find it used almost predominantly and exclusively in sales and then in point of sales, but you don't really see it used a lot in other areas. So I think some could argue that from the standpoint of a business product, the iPad was a bit of a failure, at least compared to a lot of consumer products. But is it really about technology? Is this a story about technology, or is it about a broader change in the organizational dynamics? Is it about different groups within organizations sort of re-examining the relationship with one another and figuring out better ways to work, even if they have to sort of go rogue to do that? So is this a broader trend that is extending beyond sales and marketing? So the answer to that, I'll say, is, I don't necessarily know, but what I can tell you is what I've seen. So if we jump ahead from 2010 to 2018, I'll give you an example of a project. This is something, one of the first that we can think of where we started to maybe sense that there was something afoot. So we were asked to work on a project for a really large tech company, and they had a belief, or maybe it's more of a practice. They had a practice or a belief that everybody is a leader. Even if you don't have people directly reporting to you, you are a leader. And for this company, leadership was defined by a specific set of values and principles. Now, at the time that we were brought in, their senior leaders at the very top had come to believe that not enough people in the organization were aware of the principles, understood them, and knew how to apply them, and that it now was a pretty big organizational priority to try to remedy that. So they had a fairly big project going on to try to close this gap, with a lot of different groups working on it and a lot of different tentacles and arms. And we were sort of brought in to help with some aspects of it, and which included creating some digital learning and digital learning assets that were going to kind of support the overall mission. Now, if you can imagine in a project like this, with all these different things being developed and initiatives underway that all are sort of a part of a broader initiative, it's not going to be long before people start to ask the question, where are we going to put all this stuff? Now, that sounds like a very tactical, practical question, but the impulse is a natural one, which is that we're going to be creating things for the benefit of the company, of all the people in the company. We want it to be very easy for them to find everything that we need them to find, to know where they need to be at any particular point in time, etc. So where are we going to put all this stuff? How are we going to house all of the things that we're making available to people? So that was an important question that was asked at the beginning. And of course, the first place that we looked was the LMS. And we looked at, because it's probably naturally we're going to look first. But what we found was that while there was a desire to really kind of have a single place that focused exclusively on leadership without any distraction, the LMS in this case really couldn't enable that. What was going to happen was all the leadership assets and information and training was going to be put into a big sort of pool, along with tons of other training in other areas, from compliance to marketing to sales to other sort of HR related things. And furthermore, the team was concerned that they weren't going to have the full kind of access rights, and they weren't going to be able to create sort of a unique encapsulated learner experience. So the LMS really wasn't sufficient. So at that point, we began to look at other internal systems. There are SharePoint sites over here and SharePoint site over there and intranets and things like that. But in every case, it was found that they weren't sufficient, either because they didn't sort of functionally allow the things that we wanted to try to achieve, or because they were sort of access or administrative issues as well. So in the end, this is sort of where the story ends. The point here is that we were not able to find anything that was going to work for the purposes of this project, with the pre-existing infrastructure, either the learning technology infrastructure or the broader organizational infrastructure. And so in the end, something had to be made and had to be built from scratch. So I use this as an example, as one example of rebellion. Now, I think it's worth noting that there wasn't anyone involved in this project, at least to my knowledge, that sort of had an explicit, something explicit in mind where they were thinking, I'm going to rebel against, the man, or I'm going to rebel against, sort of existing corporate strictures. We all were just focused on trying to achieve a particular business objective. What we found was that the existing infrastructure really wasn't sufficient. And so we had to go around and find another venue. So it's a small example of going rogue or a rebellion. So, but the question is, so it's just one story. Does that really mean that it's a trend? Is there really sort of a rebellion underway? And, again, I don't necessarily know, but I have my perspective, and I think that there's some evidence out there that there is, right? So the first evidence that is that it seems as though the corporate world in general, beyond L&D, seems to be moving in this direction. So they seem to be moving away from centrally governed infrastructure and services. So I'll give you an example of this, or sort of evidence. So a few months ago, last year, in the Wall Street Journal, an article was published by an MIT professor in which he argued that the centrally governed IT department is essentially obsolete. And he rooted his argument in two basic things. So number one was the fact that a centrally governed IT department, by definition, has to serve so many different functional areas that it really has no choice but to find the lowest common denominator, common to all the different functional areas, serve those as well as it can, and that it then can't really serve the specific needs of each functional area as well as it would need to. And because of that, it leaves the functional areas without the innovation and the technologies and the strategies that they really might need to advance their business goals. And the second point that he brought up, Dr. Pepper, was that, that's Dr. Pepper, I didn't realize that before, Dr. Peppard, was that the functional areas in interacting with and sort of working with IT were really required to plan out all of their needs so far in advance that it really prevented them from responding to needs that would occur in between planning cycles. So collectively, according to this author, this essentially made the functional areas and therefore the company as a whole slower, less agile, and less innovative. So he pointed out then several organizations, certainly by no means the majority, but several organizations that were now experimenting with alternative models, most of which can be characterized as basically taking IT from a centralized place and kind of dispersing it into the different functional areas so that those IT folks can become intimately familiar with the needs of those functional areas and focus on serving them well. So again, this is but one example of companies recognizing that in many cases, having something that's centrally managed and centrally governed is not always necessarily ideal. There also seems to be a movement happening in L&D as evidenced by people exploring different models or new models. So there appears to be sort of an unbundling trend. I call it unbundling. And if you think about, the way to think about unbundling, if you're not familiar with the phrase, is if you think about early, like sort of enterprise software, HR enterprise software, or even LMSs, there's sort of an incentive and an inclination to bundle as much functionality into those systems as you can, certainly from the standpoint of the vendors, because they can charge more money. So the more things that your product does, the more money you can charge for it. So if you've got an LMS, certainly you're going to want it to at least track the activity, the learning activity that's happening, but you also will have it be the primary interface through which people can access things. You add an authoring tool and add all kinds of other things. But over the last 10, 15 years or so, we've seen a more broadly sort of an unbundling trend where people have recognized that sometimes if you bundle too much functionality together, it becomes less functional and it becomes less effective. And so pairing it off and having individual systems that do a specific function very well seems to be a trend. And I think that we're seeing a bit of that in L&D. So we're seeing an unbundling of technology. So I personally think that the growth of the LXP is evidence of this. So from my perspective, really what the main thing that an LXP does, maybe the exclusive thing, but the main thing an LXP does, it essentially is an interface innovation. It creates a new user interface for your learners and probably your administrators, and it makes it easier for them to find what they need and digest it, and it provides the access to the training information in a usable way. Well, essentially, you could consider UI as a function of a traditional LMS. So in some ways, you could regard the growth of the LXP as an unbundling of the user interface, so that it can be treated in a way that's maybe more effective or more purpose-built, let's say. Now, it is true that LXPs, at least when I've seen them implemented, are oftentimes implemented the same way that LMSs are, which is they're sort of centrally managed. But at the same time, so it's possible that people aren't necessarily taking advantage of them to kind of enact an unbundling or a sort of a rebellion impulse. But I do believe that the reason that LXPs are out there is mainly because of this impulse, the desire to have that aspect to break away from the centrally managed system. So another thing that's happening, or evidence that things are unbundling, is the emergence of capability academies. So this is a concept that is being championed by, or talked about at least, by Josh Bersin. And capability academies are essentially single domain online academies that focus on a single domain. They're run by a functional area. They're not necessarily connected to an LMS. They're not centrally governed. They might, in some cases, communicate with an LMS, but they're independently run. So for example, Bersin cites that Ericsson's got a 5G academy for its sales team. Comcast has a customer service academy. We're creating a feedback academy. So we're seeing more and more of these capability academies sort of being put out there and being discussed in the thought leadership sphere. And then also, it seems as though we're moving towards, in some cases, an unbundling of content creation. So the bundled version of content creation is a centralized authority creating and delivering all of the content. But we're really seeing, again, this is something that Bersin has been talking about a lot lately and exploring and researching, is the creator economy applied to L&D. So if you think about the creator economy, if you've never heard the phrase, if you think about YouTube or Coursera or Udemy, we can all get onto those platforms and start creating content just willy-nilly, and you've got TikTok and all these things. So the idea behind the creator economy is essentially applied to the corporate world and applied to corporate L&D, is essentially the idea of empowering individuals to create training content, performance management or performance improvement content that they can put into an overall sort of marketplace, if you will, that then becomes available to the rest of the company. And we're starting to see experimenting with that too. So we've got Vodafone has got a video sharing platform, so does Hilti. And there are definitely tools and technologies now that are available to actually do this. So in sum, it does appear as though there are people that are experimenting with unbundling from large functionally complex systems and pairing off and finding ways to sort of have something that operates more on their own. And then finally, at BCL, we're seeing a lot of new pains and new requests. So, before, as a company like ours, of course, we're essentially, most of the time, we're getting some version of this request. Can you help us design a high impact training program? That's what we got all the time. And we still get that a lot, of course. But now, again, starting in 2018 and now kind of accelerating, we get a lot of other sorts of requests like, can you help us create a unique learning experience? To which, we think, well, yeah, you asked us to create a high impact training program. That's going to have a unique learning experience. And they'll say, oh, no, we don't mean that. We mean that you're going to make something for us, and then we have these people making this over here, and then we already have these. We want to put them together and have sort of a controlled learning pathway, and we want it to be walled off so that it's not sort of embedded in a bunch of other things. Can you help us with that? Or they'll say, can you host courses for us? Our content's getting lost in the LMS. Can you help us with that? Can you make a learning platform for us? And at first we would say, sure, but don't you already have an LMS? And with the response we would get back is, yeah, we do, but for any of a number of reasons, we just can't get that. It's not going to meet our needs. Okay. So, we're starting to get these other requests. We're being asked to build more and more online academies. So here are just some screenshots of some, but if you think about the before, what we were asking for before, these are all different online academies. If you look at like This America Makes on the left-hand side, each one of these tiles is sort of a course, right? So usually in the before scenario, someone would say, hey, can you make one of these or three of these for us? Now they're saying, can you make some of these for us and make this overall platform, make this overall kind of curated learning experience? So you can see we've got one here like the 3D printing program, we've got a feedback academy, we've got an immunization academy, an ALS disease academy. So these different academies, and none of these are connected to LMSs, or maybe one or two are, but they just communicate in that case, they just kind of communicate on the back end. They're all just independent, and they're run independently, specifically to serve a specific business objective and business goal. So again, that's what's the common qualities of the feedback of these online academies or capability academies, is that they essentially they focus on one domain. They've got a bunch of different courses, sometimes created by a bunch of different people, and they have a singular controlled learning experience, right? So the bottom line is that there is a lot of evidence out there to suggest that there is a move away from centrally governed systems and towards pushing administrative control out to functional areas and out to the edges of the organization. So why would this be happening, and why would it be happening now? Could be a question that you might ask. And if you're not asking it, I'll ask it on your behalf. So why is this happening now? Well, so on a broad level, first off, things have gotten very complex. There's more information available, there's more technologies. The pandemic has certainly played a role in this as well, but there's just more of everything, more information, more channels, more training that everyone has to take. And the lines between work and life are really, really blurring, especially through the pandemic. Now, this is, of course, a statement that you could have made this statement 10 years ago, could have said it 10 years before that, and you'll certainly be able to say it 10 years in the future. But it is absolutely true that the rate of change and the rate of business really continues to accelerate. And I think it's very possible that we've crossed or are in the process of crossing some sort of threshold where the rate of change is quick enough that a centrally governed business function that has to serve a lot of different functional areas is no longer able to just keep up. But certainly, because things have gotten more complex, we know that skill needs have changed too. So you've got the skills to do your job, but then you've got to learn all kinds of other skills. Again, you have to learn the leadership principles. There are all sorts of different things you have to change, and the skills that you have are decaying more quickly than they ever have. And with things like the Great Resignation and all these other things happening, it's just that people need to almost continuously be reskilled, and so you need a very agile way of doing that. And I think that, so in many ways, I think these things, either consciously or subconsciously, are driving for many people an impulse to try to simplify things and to kind of seize control of them. And on an individual level, on a learner level, and when I talk about learners, I really include me and you and everybody in this. On an individual level, what I think is happening is, again, as I've said actually a few times in the talk today, there's all this training that we have to, that this hypothetical person here, well, she's a real person, but this person here has got to learn. So she's gotta know all the things to do her job. You've got a new product coming out. She's got to learn about that. She has to learn the leadership principles. There's a new corporate restructuring and she's got to learn about that. There's a wellness program. There are all these different things that are being thrown at it her way. And then you just add on to that all the other things, that are just in vying for her attention and her time, like the TikTok and Zoom and all these different things. That what happens is all this stuff is exceeding her cognitive capacity. And when we exceed someone's cognitive capacity, as we all know, as L&D professionals, people withdraw, right? So they go somewhere else. I actually have considered doing a webinar on something that I refer to as the great withdrawal, which I think is a really big thing. People are talking about the great resignation right now, but with the pandemic and us throwing all kinds of technology at everybody, there's no doubt that it's causing some degree, in some cases, a high degree of psychological withdrawal. I would be willing to bet that there's nobody in this webinar that hasn't at some point been on a Zoom call and been looking at, checking sports scores or looking at news or doing some other sort of work. So I think that when we overburden people psychologically, it's inevitable that they're going to withdraw. And I think because of that, we're all recognizing this, and we're all, again, maybe consciously or subconsciously, realizing that one of the most important things that we need to be focusing on is focus. We need to find ways to engage with our learner populations that really helps them pare away all of the other things that are competing for their attention and allows them to focus on just what they need to be focused on at this moment in time. So again, I believe that this impulse is sort of bleeding through and starting to result in behaviors. And actually, I do want to say that another thing I didn't put in here is I think that there could be, this could also be affected by some generational dynamics. So, when I talked before about the sales teams falling into a sense of complacency. Well, millennials are now, really have long since been sort of finding their way into positions of authority. And, for all the grief that millennials get, one of the great things they bring to the table is they're less inclined to kind of look at something as it stands right now and just accept it because it's something that's been done before. So I do sense that with the millennial generation sort of really infiltrating or making its way into the corporate environment, I suspect that they're kind of looking at the way things are doing and they feel a little bit more leeway, if you will, or maybe just they have the courage to go and sort of buck the current trends. So where is this all going? Again, I can't see the future, but again, it does appear that there's a trend. And if these trends continue, I believe that we're going to see more L&D leaders breaking away from centralized learning technologies. They're going to secure their own tools. They're going to seize control over the way that learners experience content. I suspect that we will see more L&D professionals becoming more aligned with specific functional areas. And of course, that is a thing that's been around for a long time. There have always been, L&D groups that are aligned with sales, that serve sales and marketing, or that serve customer service or things like that. But I suspect that we may see more and more of that. I think that content creation, in order for us to create enough content to kind of meet everybody's needs, I suspect we're going to see more of the work of creating content distributed out to other places and folks in the organization that wouldn't necessarily have been involved before. And I think we're also going to see more distributed pockets of content throughout the organization, some of which may be hyper-focused on specific needs. So when I talked about these online academies, there could be an online academy on this topic over here, and another one over here, and another one over here. And that, of course, could lead to a certain degree of complexity in and of itself. But again, I think that that's what we're going to see. And I think because of this, we're going to see L&D playing more of a facilitator and an enabler role. So of course, L&D already does that. But I think traditionally, L&D is really focused on creating or acquiring content, training content, and delivering it. And that's always, I think, always going to be the case. But I also think that they're going to have a more expanded tool set, both from a content a pre-existing content standpoint and from a tool standpoint, and they're going to be using that not only to create content on their own, but to enable other parts of the organization to do so as well. So again, when we do this, there's going to be a greater need for curation, greater need for train the trainer, and a greater need for standards. If we're having other people without any training experience helping to create and deliver training, then of course we're going to need some way of sort of managing that and making sure that we adhere to the appropriate standards. Now, when I've been talking about sort of breaking away from centrally governed systems, and I don't want to make it sound like there is no role for centrally governed systems, or that, you know, this is some kind of permanent thing. And I don't want to actually even judge them. I'm not here necessarily to say that one way of doing things is right or wrong or better than the others. And, you know, it's very possible that that this is a trend. It could accelerate for a little bit and could be taken to its extreme, and then it could swing back. But the fact of the matter is that there are lots of reasons why you might want to have something centrally managed. For example, if you just think about it, if people are taking training from all different sorts of different systems that are embedded throughout the organization, there is a real benefit to being able to have a single place where you can find all of the learning records. And furthermore, if you work in a regulated industry, you really don't have much of a choice. I suppose that in most of those industries, you're not required to have all that information centrally, but if the regulators come asking for it, it's certainly a lot easier to find what you need if it's in a central location, rather than checking all manner of different systems, some of which you may not even be aware of. So there is a role for centralized administration. And so in the end, who knows whether this is a trend, that's how far it's going to go, and whether the pendulum might swing back. But I do personally think that there's a place in a corporate training architecture for both. Like I could envision models where functional areas have their own learning systems, but those learning systems then report data back to some kind of a centralized learning store. The technology, some organizations may already be doing this, and the technology certainly already exists. I would love to see a model like that where everyone's records are stored in a certain place, and then maybe even in an external place where you can use the blockchain to validate the credentials of the people certifying that they've taken certain courses, so that people, when they leave jobs, they can take their learning records with them. But regardless of where the future goes, the question you might be asking is, well, what does this mean for you? And again, I don't know. It depends on you and your situation. But I do think that it's very possible that you could do some things today that you might not have been able to do before. So again, you may be able to go out and get your own learning technology to create a more controlled learning experience that's separate from some other learning experiences that were created by other groups. You may be able to operate a little more nimbly like a startup. You might be able to bypass the corporate LMS if it makes sense to do so, to work more nimbly, and to build topic-specific academies and to empower workers to create content for you as well. And there are a lot of tools out there to kind of help with this, a bunch of them that are coming online or have been there for a while. And we just continue to see a lot of innovation in this area. But I think despite all of those things, the most important thing by far is really to try to use these advantages to reduce complexity for learner populations. Ultimately, in learning and development, our goal is to help the people who work in our organizations to learn what they need to learn to succeed at work. And they're just not going to learn anything if they are overwhelmed and they're faced with overwhelming complexity. So in the end, it behooves us to use whatever tools that we have to reduce complexity for our learner populations. This doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have complexity in a system, but in the way that people interact with that system, the UI and the UX, you really need that to be as simple as possible for your users who are essentially learners. And that ultimately, I think, should be the goal for all of us. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you for attending and for listening. And I think we have some time for question and answer. So yeah, why don't we move into that section of the of our webinar today?
Let's do it. If you have questions for Nathan, you still have time. Go into the Q&A pod and post your questions there. All right, so let's jump in with this question from Teresa, who says, do you see companies using their HRIS systems as the central storage system?
Well, I mean, I think that they use it as their central storage system for HR information. I think more than anything for learning records, for learning data, I think that the LMS is used more for that. I do understand that a lot of times those two systems integrate and that there are vendors that sell both types of systems. But certainly an HR information system is an example of a centrally governed system. In the case of HR, it may make total sense for that to be centrally governed, given that HR is fundamentally a business function that serves everyone in the organization. But from an LMS standpoint, I mean, from a learning record standpoint, I regard the LMS as the most typical or prototypical centrally governed learning record store, if you will. And I guess I want to qualify that by saying that I'm not sure there is, someone can make a lot of generalizations about the learning technology infrastructure and the learning management infrastructure that organizations have in place. But overall, most organizations have something unique going on. So they can't all be, they're not all doing the exact same things. But generally speaking, for me, it's the LMS is really the center of centrally governed learning activity and learning activity records.
Okay. All right, let's keep it going here. This question came in from Yvonne. Yvonne says, do you think there is any role for centralized administration of the training function, or do you think all of it should be distributed to the functional areas?
I'm going to give them the most disappointing answer to this question because it depends. It depends is not what anybody wants to hear, but I think it really depends on the mission and the goal of the L&D department. If, for example, let's say that you have an L&D group that is aligned with HR, meaning they have a scope of authority that spans the entire organization. And they're really focused mainly on these initiatives that sort of come from the C-suite, like management and leadership and things like that. I'm not sure that it's possible to distribute the work to the functional areas, nor do I think that it makes sense. On the other hand, when you have an L&D department that has to serve, like, let's say that it's in a credit card company and it has to serve everyone. It has to serve, and I've seen this model in place. It's got to serve, people in finance and people in sales, and it has to serve everybody. Then I do think that it may make sense to experiment with distributing at least some of the L&D work to the functional areas. If someone were to do that, it may also make sense to leave, for example, like a training operations group at the center, whose job is to help support and serve the different L&D folks that are working in the functional areas. I've seen that in place as well. In fact, the initial story that I told with the big tech company, that's how they evolved. That's how they have begun to do things. So, it's really going to depend on what the mission and goal of the L&D group is, who they serve, and what makes the most sense. What is going to enable them to serve their customers in the quickest and the most effective way.
All right, okay. A lot of people are going back and forth between UI, UX. I've seen some definitions given in the chat, which is great, but Kimberly wants to know if you can give some recommendations on how to simplify UI, UX.
Well, I think that, try to think about this. So It's hard to talk about this in a general way, but I think in general, having well-defined learning pathways, and this is conceptual, this is independent of technology at first. Naturally, so I'll talk about that. So if everybody has a learning pathway and that all of their, and someone has done the job besides the learner. Now, certainly the learner can be involved in the process, but someone has taken the time to look at all of the things that someone has decided this person needs to learn, prioritize them, and put them into some sort of a learning pathway that communicates to your learner populations that the priority of things and the order of things, and peels away things that they don't have to focus on at that particular point in time. Yes, it's true that it is helpful for everyone, for every learner to be able to have a sort of a meta view of what their learning journey and their learning pathway will be like. But in the end, that can serve to distract them from what they have to do right now. Too much of a look at what all has to be done, or a system that gives them too much choice in the matter, or requires them to make a decision about what to do next, really just increases the possibility that they'll get lost in everything that's out there. So I think that having strong learning pathways for everyone is really important, and therefore having an interface with the learning system that matches that. So, I mean, it's hard to not talk about, people interface with the learning and development function in ways that don't involve technology necessarily, but because we do use technology for this, having technological systems that allow for those types of individualized experiences. And I think that's very important. So the question that you asked is a really big one. And so, but that's sort of generally speaking what my response to that.
Love it. It was a big question. I think you handled it beautifully, and Kimberly agreed in the chat. So we're on track here. And we only have a few moments, so there's only so much you can do with one question at the end of the hour.
Sure.
A couple of questions coming in from Heather and Uti regarding measuring success, tracking completion results. If you're unbundling the L&D function, is that still going to be a central focus for L&D? Is it tied to the current LMS? How does that work?
Well, one of the implications of, so when I think about evaluating anything, I have it, it's always, to me, it's tied to budget. It's hard for me to think about evaluation without thinking about budget and where budget comes from. So one of the implications of distributing the learning and development function to the different functional areas, the big question becomes, who's paying for it? Where does the money come from? Because, ultimately, as we all know, sort of organizational psychology and organizational dynamics, that's going to have a major impact on how people behave and how people act. I assume that if a company formally distributes some or all of its learning and development resources into the functional areas, then it's up to the functional areas to determine what kind of, define the budget for it. And then ultimately the L&D folks are kind of answerable to those, whoever holds the budget in marketing, whoever holds the budget in product development, whoever holds it, et cetera. So bringing it back to the evaluation question, I think for me, evaluation, how do you evaluate? How do you track those records? It all goes back to, what does your sponsor, whoever holds the budget, what are they trying to achieve, and how important is it to them to have validation that they have achieved that their investment has been well spent. So again, if the budget's coming from the functional area, the functional area is the one that's setting priorities, and they're essentially determining what their objectives are, then ultimately it makes sense, to me at least, that at least in that model, that data related to evaluation and record keeping and things like that are housed locally, if you will, in the functional area as well. Now, of course, there are always going to be exceptions to that concept. Like I said before, in a regulated environment, those records have to be easily accessible. And if they're distributed throughout the organization, they're still accessible, but they're not that easy to access. So, in the end, you will need to send that back. But again, because I've never created a learning record store, so I can't say universally why learning record stores were created. But I've always thought and imagined that the reason that they were created was so that you could institute a system where you could divorce record keeping from the various technologies that you're using. And then your independent record store could easily communicate with those things and capture all of that data. So I feel very confident that regardless of whether an independent learning record store is sold that way or messaged that way, that it can be used in that fashion. So anyway, I hope that answers the question.
All right, well, we've got tons of them, so I'm going to keep them coming here, Nathan.
Sure.
Kelly says, when you decentralize development of training, how do you ensure that learning, how do you ensure learning principles, UDL and the like, are not lost? I mean, not everyone knows how to develop good training.
Yeah. So that is I would imagine that is, so that, in fact, I shouldn't say, I don't just imagine it. That is a challenge that a lot of people face. And I think that in general, regardless of the issues that we're talking about, because, you know, many training departments depend on non-training professionals to deliver their training. You know, we conduct market research quite a lot, and we talk to a ton of people that are in that exact same boat. And I think that ultimately, what we have seen a demand for is simplified training for non-trainers, if you will. And that goes across the board. So we're not necessarily exclusively talking about facilitation skills, but there is absolutely demand for some way to quickly but effectively help non-training experts develop the skills they need to contribute to the training process. So if it's like, if we're just talking about creating training, it's sort of like maybe an instructional design 101 sort of thing. But I do think, and I also think that there are standards. So I'll tell you an example of this, and the context is very different, but I do think that there could be some lessons applied. So I'm aware of a project that took place in one of the states in India, where they essentially set up a system where in places like this, in this particular state, a lot of healthcare is provided not at clinics, but they have community health workers that actually go out into the communities and they visit people house to house, and that's how they provide a lot of service, especially for rural areas. So these community health workers sort of go out and they work from a clinic, but they go out into their neighborhoods. So I'm aware of a system where they wanted to encourage, they equipped them all the community health workers with phones and smartphones, and they wanted to encourage them to create videos and create simple videos that they could use both with their patients and with each other to train each other. But the thing is that none of the community health workers had any form of training whatsoever, either on creating videos, creating content, or even in medicine, actually. So the way that they worked it was, in each of the different geographic areas, they had a board of physicians, and if a community health worker wanted to create some content, they would submit a request, and they would say a little one-page request and say, hey, I want to create a video on this. The board would evaluate it and say, yes, go ahead and make that. And they would get some training on how to produce the videos. Then once the video was done, they would submit it back to the board to make sure that it was medically accurate, because of course, you know, we're talking about healthcare here, and it would be medically accurate, and then submit it back out. And they were highly successful at doing this in a fairly like uncontrolled environment, I guess it would say. So, you know, I think that in the end, this is new enough that they're gonna have people experimenting with different models. But I do think that there are ways to do it by creating standards or by creating systems in place that kind of create some kind of guidelines that people can follow or kind of try to stay within when they're creating the content. But I do think that that's, when it comes to having user populations generating training content, that is the central problem to solve. That is it is, how do we make sure that people are adhering to standards? How do we make sure they're not putting something out there that is really counter to what we need them to be doing, et cetera? And that's where I think the curation, standards, and some kind of process or system in place to kind of ensure that we're getting quality content in there are going to be important.
All right, I've got my co-host here to help me bring it home this afternoon. Let's see, from creating content to accessing it, Michael here has a question. He says he's struggling. He says, I fully agree with the decentralization of content creation. SMEs performing the job are a valuable resource. However, I'm struggling a bit to see the benefit of decentralized content hosting or distributed pockets of content. Having multiple places to go for different types of training could cause confusion and inefficiencies. What do you have for that, Nathan?
Here's the way I think about it. So again, I don't know I don't want to make a generalized statement that one of those models is better than the other. I think it's situation dependent. Here's the way I think of an LMS. Okay, so the LMS versus sort of the more small pocket of content. Let's say that I fish and I don't know a ton about fishing, but I want to go get some fish because I fish for smallmouth bass in creeks, which is different than fishing for smallmouth bass in lakes. So I want to go get some lures that will help me. One option is I can go to Walmart. So what's going to happen at Walmart is I'm going to walk in and I'm going to see row after row of like lawn furniture and puzzles and clothes and all these different things. And there's all this stuff. And it's, I have to find my way to the sporting goods section. Then in there, I have to find my way to the fishing section. And then I just have a huge array of stuff. And I don't really know what's best. Maybe there's a person there. Maybe they know what they're doing. Maybe they don't. That's sort of the Walmart version. Or I could go to like an Orvis store where it's wood paneled, and when I walk in, there's fish on the wall and everything, and when I walk in the door, there's a guy there, and let's say that's an old guy and he's wearing a hat with fishing lures and and a fishing vest and all this kind of stuff, and he walks up and he says to me, hey there, welcome to Orvis, how can I help you? And I say, I'm going to be fishing these creeks, etc. And then the guy says, oh, I know, in a creek you want to do this, blah, blah, blah. And he kind of holds your hand and helps you with that. So I think that there are some circumstances in which it's going to make sense for you to have that Orvis model. And there are other circumstances when it's going to make sense to have the Walmart model. And I think, it's all going to depend on what you're trying to achieve, what a specific initiative is, and what the goal is. So could a bunch of different places be confusing? It certainly could, for sure. But it all depends. Like not everyone is necessarily going to have a ton of different portals that they have to keep a track of and manage. So yeah, I think it's a very valid point. And I again think it's one of the things that will have to be worked through as you do this. But at the same time, again, we're seeing a lot of people that really feel it's important enough to be able to give a unique experience like the one in Orvis that they're actually doing it.
All right, I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question here. This one came in from Preethi. Preethi wants to know, do you think the pendulum could swing too far in the direction of functional autonomy?
Yes, it could. for many of the same reasons that people are bringing up with these questions today. Like, how do you manage the process of having non-training professionals create content? How do you make sure that it's of good quality? How do you make sure that it's not contradicting really what should be? And I think, again, just imagine an environment where everything is completely managed by a bunch of independent systems. And then you have an individual who's curious and they want to have their learning record. They say, hey, listen, can I get a sense? Maybe they're using it for part of their performance evaluation or to build a case for promotion or something like that. And they've gone and they've a lot of the training they've taken is sort of being archived in a lot of different systems. I do think that it can swing too far. And I think that ultimately, again, for me, what the ideal scenario is one more like what I talked about at the end of the presentation, which is one where someone has taken the time to identify in advance those facets of learning in general, of managing a learning program that are best managed centrally and those that are best managed at the functional areas. And then they put in place practices, tools, and technologies that really enable that. So that enable that to happen so that the functional areas have the appropriate amount of authority and autonomy and that the central governing authority does as well. And I believe that the technology exists to do that today. I don't think anything new needs to be created. I think it's a matter of sitting down and doing it.
I love it. Love it. It's a matter of sitting down and just doing it. It's as easy as that. I wish it was as easy as that. But Nathan, you've made it easier with all this information today. There's been really great conversation going on in the chat. There's tons of questions still. We did not get to all of them. We don't have time to get to all of them, but I'm sure Nathan and his team are going to reach out to any of you whose questions didn't get answered. So do not fret. I know that they will be in touch from BCL. Nathan, thank you for putting all of this together for us. It was a really fun learning event, lots of information. We always appreciate when BCL is here to present to our audience. So I thank you one more time.
Thank you for hosting, and thank you everyone for coming and participating and engaging. I really do appreciate it.
For sure. All right, everyone. You can find more information about our events on trainingindustry.com/webinars. Lots of events coming up here in the future. Of course, all of our events do pre-qualify you for 1 credit hour by ISPI, SHRM, HRCI, and CPTM. What is CPTM? It's the Certified Professional in Training Management Program. If you're looking to up your personal and professional game by linking your learning initiatives to your organizational goals, this is the program for you. trainingindustry.com/CPTM to find out more information about how you can join any of our virtual training programs. Of course, we'd love to see you join us at our Training Industry Conference and Expo happening live June, Raleigh, North Carolina. Come meet us in person. All right, everyone, one last time, thank you to Nathan and BCL for sponsoring today's event, bringing such great content to our viewers. And of course, thanks to all of you for attending. Until we see you back here next time, enjoy it out there.